The book is Lincoln's Forgotten Ally, Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, and the author and Lincoln Prize winner is Elizabeth Leonard. Elizabeth, tell our audience who this man is.
Judge Holt is a Kentucky native who came to Washington in 1857 after a career as a lawyer and an orator, and became a member of James Buchanan's cabinet and served in James Buchanan's cabinet until the very end of Buchanan's administration. His last post in that administration was to serve as the Secretary of War. So he was the Secretary of War during the Secession winter. He then, in 1862, after Lincoln had become president and about a year and a half into the war, became Lincoln's Judge Advocate General, which means that he was the head of military justice and oversaw all of the court-martials and military commissions and so on that the administration, the War Department, had to conduct.
Why a book on this gentleman?
Well, the title should give you a clue. I think that he's a very important figure, and he has been completely understudied. He is not entirely forgotten. That might be a slightly misleading aspect of the title. He is remembered for one aspect of his service in the government, which is that he was the prosecutor of the assassins of Lincoln, of John Wilkes Booth's action team. But he served in the federal government from 1857 until 1875. He was very important during the Civil War. His role as Judge Advocate General was extremely significant to Lincoln. His support for Lincoln's policies was very important, and his story has just been lost. So I thought it was time that somebody brought that story to light.
What did you learn about him? I mean, I obviously had an interest in him going in, but through the process, what did you learn about him that most interested you?
Well, I knew from very early on in my acquaintance with Judge Holt as a historical figure that he was a complicated person. And in fact, my initial introduction to him was in connection with my first book, where I was studying women's involvement in the Civil War. And he appeared as someone who issued a legal brief from the administration that made sure that one of the women I was studying was not allowed to continue working for the federal government as a doctor. And I was very angry at him. And I knew that he was a very complicated and powerful figure. The more I studied him, the more I found that he was even more complicated than I had realized. A very interesting, wise, thoughtful, prickly, difficult, challenging figure who was both powerfully loved and powerfully hated. And even I came to forgive him for his, the reasons that I was initially so angry at him. But I'm very aware of the complexity of his character. And I think that's the thing that I found most interesting and that was most striking to me as I did my research, just the deep complexity of this person and the profound ways in which his choices affected his life.
Can you expand upon that?
Well, most significantly, I'd say in terms of his choices, he was a Kentuckian. He grew up in a slaveholding family. His entire family went with the Confederacy with the exception of one aunt, his lovely Aunt Mary Ann, who was a loyal Unionist. So by making the choice to serve the Union, initially as James Buchanan's Secretary of War, and not support secession, and then by making the choice to work as Lincoln's Judge Advocate General, and even before that to serve very faithfully as Lincoln's agent to try to keep Kentucky from seceding, he made choices that damaged his relationships with almost everybody he knew and everybody he loved for the first half of his life. So that was very interesting to me.
I've read a couple of reviews after you won the Lincoln Prize, and they state, one, how great the book is, but they say you really expose his strengths and his weaknesses.
Right.
What were his strengths? What were those weaknesses?
Well, among his strengths, I would include his enormous intelligence. He was very learned. He was very bright. His family had recognized his intelligence from early on in his life and sort of positioned him as the member of the family or of his generation that would go forth and bring glory upon the family. He was very committed. Once he made a decision, He stuck with that decision. He was very loyal, and he was very determined. So those are the kinds of strengths that he had, or those are among his strengths. His weaknesses are sometimes related to his strengths. Certainly the thing people remember most about him, if they remember him at all, is his prosecution of the Lincoln assassins. And he was determined to punish them. He was sure that the people that were before the bar in Washington were guilty, and he was determined to punish them. And in order to do that, he pursued some very bad leads and made some decisions about witnesses that were not very smart, but that reflected his determination to avenge Lincoln's death. So as much as he was strong and determined and committed, he sometimes could go too far. And I would say one of his greatest weaknesses is that he really had a hard time forgiving even those people who were close to him at one point when he felt they had made the wrong decision. For example, the family members that went with the Confederacy. It was very hard for him to forgive them and move forward. That was difficult. A very, very sensitive person.
So for people who have seen The Conspirator,
right,
Hollywood movie, and have seen his depiction in that, how
right,
would you compare that depiction with what you learned?
Well, I think the acting is great. I think the actor did a wonderful job portraying a character. It is not the Joseph Holt that I know from my research. I'm delighted, of course, that Joseph Holt's name has now become known and that he has finally hit the silver screen. But the character in The Conspirator is much less law-abiding and much more manipulative and vicious than the Joseph Holt that I know, and underhanded. I think one of the things that the film tries to suggest is that the federal government, largely in the person of Edwin Stanton and the person of Joseph Holt, basically railroaded poor Mary Surratt to her death, and without any interest in what the truth was. They determined that she should hang regardless, and they went after her, poor Mary Surratt. And this just isn't the way the assassination trial played out, and it certainly, there was no deal between Stanton and Holt to make sure that she was convicted and so on. So it makes him out into a truly vengeful, two-dimensional character that really doesn't reflect who he is as I know him.
Well, being Judge Advocate General during the Lincoln administration and afterwards must have been an incredibly difficult job. Could you sort of expand upon what that job was, maybe before the war, and then the job that he ended up in? Well,
the job before the war was basically, there was one person who had a small office who kept track of whatever sorts of military offenses occurred in an army that was 16,000 people strong, you know, right up prior to the war. That's how big the U.S. Army was. During the Civil War, the Army expanded to, 3 million people, 2.5 million or so in the North, and this meant that the amount of casework that he had to oversee was extraordinary, and he also was given responsibility for pursuing civilians who were engaged in disloyal acts, treasonous behavior, and so on. So although he didn't pursue every case, he didn't serve on every case himself, obviously a lot of court-martials went on in the field and so on, it was his responsibility to make sure that justice was to make sure as much as he could that justice was prevailing in these cases and that punishment was being meted out as it should be, and that people's rights were being protected and so on. So it was a massive assignment that went way past the end of the war. He stayed in that position until 1875. So it was dramatically expanded position. And he also had the role in that position of making law. So much law about war didn't even exist because this was a war the likes of which the United States had never seen. So many policies around how the war should be conducted and so on needed to be created, and he was very influential there. And he also was responsible to a great extent for making sure that the president's policies were supported and that people followed his policies, not least of which was emancipation. So he had an enormous responsible job and worked constantly.
Some of your passages in the book really illuminate his relationship with Lincoln.
Right.
Could you talk about that relationship, how often they met, what
Right.
the relationship was like?
Yeah, my sense of their relationship is that it must have been extremely cordial, extremely mutually respectful. Many people have asked me over the years, did he ever meet Lincoln at all? What kind of contact did they have? And they met often and for many hours at a time. Any capital case had to be discussed with the president, and the president had to sign off on it. And there were a lot of those cases that came across Holt's desk. So any of those, sometimes he would go up to the White House when Lincoln had time, and they could sit for 6 or 7 hours together discussing dozens and dozens of cases and making decisions. As I note in the book, Lincoln handpicked him. Certainly there were people who would have recommended him, but Lincoln chose him and appointed him to be his Judge Advocate General. So I think Lincoln knew of him beforehand, I know he did, and respected him and knew he was the right man for the job. The only thing I'll add to that is that I think if you could argue that their dynamic was sort of a good cop, bad cop dynamic, and invariably Holt would have been playing the bad cop or the tough cop, that Lincoln was much more inclined to pardon if he could, and Holt was tougher. But Lincoln often agreed, and they agreed something like 80% of the time. But if there was a choice, it was most likely Lincoln who was going to say, let's pardon this fellow.
Well, obviously he supported the president.
And he loved him.
Okay, that was my question, what his thoughts were about Lincoln as a person.
Well, I think that he probably thought that Lincoln was a little soft, on some things related to military law. I think that he probably, like Stanton, wished that Lincoln was a little more self-protective. Lincoln was famous for riding out without any protection, and Holt, one of the things he did at the very end of his assignment as Buchanan's Secretary of War was make sure that Lincoln got into Washington and was inaugurated safely. And he carried the pride of having overseen that throughout the war, and having spent many hours and days and weeks trying to find where the traitors were in the North the Northerners knew the South was at odds with them, but where were the South's allies in the North? How can they be uncovered? How can their plots be stopped? And so on, and Holt was very involved with that as well. He was very devoted to Lincoln, and I think when Lincoln was assassinated, I can't even imagine how devastating that would have been for him, especially looking back 4 years and knowing that he himself had been so instrumental in making sure that Lincoln was safe at the start of his presidency.
Do you think that personal relationship and his feelings toward Lincoln potentially could have clouded at all the prosecution of Mary Surratt and the conspirators?
I think it factors into why he became so obsessed, certainly. But I think there are signs of his determination to punish the leadership of the Confederacy throughout the war. So before the assassination, you can find him talking about the way traitors should be handled. He never blamed the common people in the South. He never blamed the people who were misled by these terrible leaders who were seeking their own power and so forth. But he was quite angry at all of the leadership, people like Jefferson Davis and so on, who he had known when he was in Buchanan's administration, and Davis was a senator, and had, his own brother-in-law, David Yulee, the senator from Florida, who had left, Congress in the early part of 1861. So he already was enraged. But I think his devotion to Lincoln and his affection for him would certainly have contributed to him making some bad judgment calls as he moved through the trial, although many people said that he conducted an extremely fair trial during the time that the trial was underway. After the fact, I think there was a lot of shock that Mary Surratt actually was executed, although prior to her execution there were clamorings for her execution in the press. But when it really happened, I think it was very shocking to a lot of people, and it's at that point that the condemnation of Holt's conduct of the trial really begins to be heard.
After 9/11, there was a huge debate in this country with the Patriot Act and how that impacted civil liberties.
Right.
I've got to think, and reading some of the book, that was a huge, huge area, even during that time.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, George W. Bush, President Bush, made that connection explicitly, connected himself, made the parallel with Lincoln and the need to suppress civil liberties in order to protect the nation.
Where did Judge Holt fall down on that?
He would certainly have said there are places where civil liberties need to be suppressed. But in doing so, it tends to be easier for people to look at Holt and say what a wicked and oppressive man he was, and forget that these were Lincoln's own policies, and he was pursuing Lincoln's policies. Lincoln named him Judge Advocate General on September 3rd, 1862, and he suspended the writ of habeas corpus that same month. So it was only 2 to 3 weeks after Lincoln appointed Holt that he suspended the writ of habeas corpus and also issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He wouldn't have put Holt in that position if he didn't expect him to follow through on those policies and to support them. So Holt was doing Lincoln's work, but it's a lot easier to get mad at Holt because he didn't become a martyr the way Lincoln did, you know.
Was it an issue during that time as it is now? I mean,
absolutely. Oh yes, it was a big issue. The issue of the suppression of civil liberties. Yes, there were many complaints, and even Lincoln had a famous dispute with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Taney, about the suppression of civil liberties. But Lincoln's response was, should I protect one law in order to watch the entire nation collapse? You know, if you protect the civil liberties of people to rebel to that extent that they destroy the nation, then what have you done, really? Better to save the nation.
Where did, you mentioned he was from Kentucky?
Mm-hmm.
When he was young, family was a slave-owning family?
Yes, in a very, very tiny town on the Ohio River.
How did he make that transition and his family not make that transition, and how did it impact him personally?
That is a really good question. And in fact, as I think about where I'd like to go in my future research, that's one of the things that I really would love to understand better. He came from a family that had a certain set of values. He loved his family. He was very close to his family. But he was lifted up out of his family and sent to get an education of a sort that no one else in his family got. He did have a brother who became a doctor, but he didn't have anybody else who went as far as he did in terms of his education. And then going out into the world in the way that he did. He was lifted up to become this very important figure, and he traveled around the world. He took 2 extended trips to Europe and the Middle East, and these were very influential for him. He saw the importance, or he understood the importance of the American Republican system in a way that he might not have had he not traveled, and so on. But there are many questions, particularly I think about his transition to becoming such an adamant emancipationist that I think are still somewhat mysterious. So I think we can explain some of his support for the Union based on his having traveled more, having gone outside of the Union, having had this education that other members of his family didn't have, and having had the experience that he had. Where that anti-slavery kernel started in him, that's a mystery to me. And that can be traced back to his teens, actually. I cite a speech that he gave when he was about 17, where he spoke very harshly about slavery. And I don't quite understand where that came from. And then later in his life, while he was still a young man and still living in Kentucky and part of the time in Mississippi, there were letters from his uncles. While he himself still was committed to slavery, letters from his uncles that nevertheless suggested that they suspected that he would someday become an abolitionist. And they hoped he wouldn't, but they suspected that someday he would move to a northern state. And they hoped that he wouldn't. And they begged him not to betray his roots. And yet he did. And how he made that transition is a mystery. Unfortunately, so much of the material we have on Holt, although it's abundant, the vast majority is material that is stuff that people sent, correspondence that people sent to Holt, and we have to try to discern what he was thinking based on things that people say to him and guess what he wrote in response or what he had written that provoked them to say those things. What we need is his letters and his diary, if there was a diary where he wrote down his thoughts, but we just don't have those things, and we don't have an autobiography. So that would be a very interesting question to be able to answer.
There's so many books have been written about Lincoln, about the Civil War. How do you go about writing a book like this? What's your process?
Well, for me, the beginning is just once I have a sense of something that's interesting to me, burying myself in the archives, really. And I spent years in smaller chunks of time at the National Archives and the Library of Congress, and then going to Kentucky and so on, pursuing the primary sources. And I also, in the case of this book, had the amazing good fortune of meeting descendants of one of his brothers. And those people became significant contributors to my understanding of him based on the lore that had come down through their family about him and the material that they still had that was related to him. And they actually had some of the letters that he had written to a niece and a nephew and so on. So it's really, for me, it's the primary sources, just immersing myself in those and then beginning to try to sort through it and create some kind of narrative. But historians are always in the business of putting puzzles together, right, and making sense out of chaos. And I hope I've done him justice, but it's a very complicated process. And I know I've been asked whether I would be interested in doing a biography of Benjamin Butler, because he is a Colby graduate, and he was a very important Civil War general and a very complicated figure as well. And I've thought about it, but I'm not sure how many biographies a person can do in their lifetime. It takes a lot of getting to know somebody. I've lived with Joseph Holt, in my head for a long time. So,
for some writers, going to a place where something happened and sort of connecting back is important. Did you go to the Navy Yard? Are there other places that you went?
Absolutely. I because I came to Holt, well, I first, was introduced to him early on in my research on women in the Civil War, but later I wrote a book that focused primarily on the assassination and its aftermath. And at that point, I went to all kinds of places around Washington and so on, and I actually stayed at a hotel that was right next to Mary Surratt's house and so on. So I went to a lot of places that were relevant to the assassination. And then as I was studying his life more fully, I went to Kentucky and went to see his old family mansion and went to the places where he'd gone to school. Some of, there are remnants of those things there. I've been to places where he lived, but there's nothing left. He had a beautiful mansion in Louisville that's completely gone. He had a beautiful mansion in Washington that's completely gone too. But I've been to those places and then been to Stephensport, where his grave is, and visited this broken down old mansion that is still there, but also visited his grave. And it is an interesting thing about Holt, I think, that he, as much as he left Kentucky and left his family and left his family's values behind, when he died, he wanted to go back, and he did go back. And there was some reconciliation after the war with one small branch of the family, which happens to be the branch who's, the contemporary people I know. And somehow that did bring him back to Kentucky, and he's buried right next to where his parents used to live, and where he was raised.
In your book, you write about him being dispatched to the West.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of the reviews of the book, it says one of the new things you find out is about the perspectives on emancipation in Kentucky.
Right.
So what is there that's new on that topic?
Well, I guess actually the border states in general have been pretty much neglected. That is kind of new ground. We keep going over the same old ground in Civil War history a lot, but there is always new ground if you look around. And the border states have been very much neglected, and the complexity of the border states is something that's being examined a lot. There are many people, I think, who traditionally would have assumed that because Kentucky stayed in the Union, it must have been a pro-emancipation state. But of course, Kentucky didn't stay in the Union for the sake of emancipation. Kentucky stayed in the Union for the sake of the Union. And when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it created a lot of conflict in Kentucky between those who wanted to keep the Union as it was and those who, like Holt, believed that the Union must be preserved and nothing, not even slavery, should be allowed to destroy it, and so slavery had to be abandoned. So there was a tremendous amount of conflict in Kentucky that he was at the front end of the people who wanted to preserve the Union and dump slavery if you have to dump it. And actually he was more actively in favor of emancipating the slaves by that point. It wasn't just a concession to the Union, but there were many virulently anti-emancipationist Kentuckians, and some people have said Kentucky is a post-war Confederate state. Kentucky did not ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution until 1975. 1975. So it didn't have to, because the law of the land is, after 2/3 of the states ratify, it becomes the law. But Kentucky held out until the 20th century, the late 20th century, emancipating its slaves, or supporting that amendment. So that's pretty impressive for a state that stayed in the Union.
Yeah.
and was Lincoln's home state too, of course.
That's right. With all that as a backdrop, why is he Lincoln's forgotten ally?
I think part of it is because of the nature of Kentucky's post-war history. If he was a Union man and the state was really somewhat angry at the direction the Union policy took, then there's not much to celebrate about Holt, right? He was, in many ways, Lincoln's hammer. And if you really didn't like emancipation, and so on, so Kentucky wouldn't be inclined to celebrate him, except perhaps the Unionists in the state. He was also an intensely private person, someone who never sought electoral office. And so he didn't do a whole lot to promote himself. Although he lived a very long life. He lived into the late 1800s, 1894 he died. But he retreated, especially in the last 20 years of life, into pretty much a private world and didn't promote himself. And I also think that soon after the war was over, very soon after the war was over, much of the nation was guided by or inspired by a desire for reconciliation among whites. Too bad for anybody else. And Holt did not represent that point of view. He was very distressed at the rapidity with which the nation was unified and the former slaves' welfare was abandoned. And so he was a contrarian, and again, didn't have a place in that narrative that was being created after the war, a place for being celebrated in the way that the narrative was being developed after the war. So he retreated, and he was quite bitter actually at the end, but he sort of retreated to his private world and tried to reconstruct some relationships with family members, descendants of his own generation, his nephew and niece in particular, and clung to his very good friends of his life, but didn't do anything to sort of keep himself in the public eye.
You've won the very prestigious Lincoln Prize.
I'm so delighted.
In 2012, this is the most recent one. Has it changed anything for you?
Well, it's certainly a source of enormous pride. And there is a sense in which you can feel very good and proud of your own work and confident in its value without getting outside accolades, but it doesn't hurt to get them, and it's very reassuring. I feel that although I feel that I had respect in my profession, not just at Colby, but in the larger world of Civil War history, I think it has given people a reason to take me more seriously. Not that I felt that they didn't take me seriously before, but it puts a little bounce in your step.
For folks watching this who have not read the book yet, they've learned a fair amount about the book here. What do you want to leave them with? What's there to entice them to read this book?
I think it is a great human story. If you just want to read a biography of a fascinating human being, if you like biography, it's a great human story. If you like to study the Civil War, but you're eager to learn something really that you didn't know, I can assure you this is a great place to go, because there are very few people who know much about Joseph Holt, more now than before. But I think he's a very important figure to know, and I think it will open up all kinds of areas of study, just knowing more about him. So I think it's a great story. I think he's a very compelling figure, and for Civil War enthusiasts, why not learn something new?
Elizabeth Leonard, thank you very much for spending the time with us.
Thank you.